Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to clean Alps switches. This tutorial is focused on doing a full soft clean, which is the kind of thing you want to do if your switches feel suboptimal but salvageable. This board is worse than that, but I figured it would be a good subject for demonstration and experimentation. For example, this Focus 747 and Leading Edge DC 2014 were both, let's say, 9 out of 10, so very good but not perfect. And with this procedure you can restore them fully and without having to do things like desoldering, a process that I call a soft clean. I'll show you my techniques for taking the switches apart and putting them together again as easily as possible, what parts are most often at fault, and how to fix it. Note that if your switches feel really bad, for example when they're very dirty or have been subjected to heavy use, you'll most likely need to do a more elaborate and aggressive deep clean and a full restoration instead, which I'll be releasing a video on in a few days' time. There's also a tutorial coming on what to do if your switches don't work at all anymore, such as when they're not registering properly. Anyway, let's get on with the clean. The first thing you want to do is take off the keycaps. I recommend using wire pullers like this to take off the single unit keycaps. What you do is as follows. You put them in between a key, then you twist it like so, and then you pull straight up. Note that the first time that you'll pull Alps keycaps, it'll be quite difficult because the factory fit is really tight, so don't worry too much about it. As long as you pull straight up, it won't matter too much. For the bigger keycaps, the ones that the wire keycaps can't fit around, such as the shift key or the spacebar, I would recommend using 1 or 2 ring pullers like this. Both of these types of key pullers cost about $1 a piece shipped from China, so I just get a bunch to be honest. While you're at it, you might as well clean the keycaps. Just let them soak in warm, not hot, soapy water for a day or multiple days if they're very ugly, then rinse them thoroughly several times and dry them off with a towel. Now that the keycaps are off, I even discovered 2 rogue salmon switches by the way, we're going to do a pre-clean. For this you'll want to brush out and or hoover the plate as much as possible. Just brush towards the hoover as you move along the switches, like this basically. If there's dirt or dust in the case as well, hoover that up too. We're doing this to make sure that the dirt doesn't find its way back into the switches and ruin the feeling again. After this, you'll need to open the switches. I found the best way to do this is by using 2 toothpicks, which you slide between the 2 retaining tabs on the top and the bottom to open them up a bit. Like so. And then use some tweezers to open them yet further, as such. Then you can take these out and pull off the top by pulling on the slider, as such. This does leave a small scratch on the plastic where the tweezers were, but it's on an area that doesn't impact switch feel or operation, so it's not the end of the world. You can also use only the toothpicks to do it without leaving any scars at all, but this is a faster method. Note, I would open each and clean each switch separately to avoid mixing up any of the parts at this point. If you keep the same slider, leaf spring and housing with the same switches, I think it gives a better result. These same parts have been mated in the switch for around 20 to 30 years by now after all, so as they are, they probably fit each other the best. If you're using SKCM switches, which are linear, your switches will have an LED cutout on one side that makes it very difficult to take the top off with just toothpicks. Instead, I'd use 1 toothpick to loosen the normal side, like so, slide in the tweezers, here, stick the other end in the LED cutout, and then push outwards to open the retaining tabs. So in total, it should look like this. There you go. Also, I should mention that simplified Alps and Alps clones are much more difficult to reassemble than complicated Alps, so only do this procedure on those types of switches if you're confident that you can put them together again. Try it out on a single one first if you're unsure. Disassembled, you can now see the innards. This is the switch plate, which is a sandwich of contact plates with a leaf spring at the front that serves as an actuator, a coil spring that goes in the middle, and this is the tactile leaf. This is the top housing, and that's a slider. Now there are 4 main sources of friction. The biggest one, and the one that's at fault in the large majority of cases of scratchiness, is the friction between the slider and this track in the top housing here. Secondary ones are the friction between the actuator and the slider. If your switches have pre-applied lubricant, such as these oranges, you can usually see bits of it missing where the actuator scraped along it, and sometimes dark deposits like this. And something similar goes for the tactile leaf. The tactile leaf is least often at fault in my experience though. Finally, there's friction between your spring stem and the spring itself. This is not usually a huge cause, but it can get pretty bad if you have very rusted springs, in which case you might want to consider swapping the springs as well. In order to clean them out, we're just going to take out the dust. More shouldn't be necessary, and with Alps I wouldn't do more than is strictly needed, to be honest. So first, get a nice brush like this. It's easier to do if the brush is sharp rather than bushy, and hoover at the bottom housing while you brush towards it, like this, so to speak. Make sure you brush off the actuator too if it appears dirty. Blow into the spring to quickly get rid of any dust on it and gently stretch it to work loose any dirt. Then use a finer but still sharp brush to clean out the entirety of the inside of the housing, especially the tracks of the slider, and don't forget the slits on top as well, which are these things. Just brush everything off, including in all the many nooks and crannies. You can use canned air as well, but you'll need a lot of it, so it might be a bit expensive. A compressor is ideal. If the outside of the housing is dirty, clean that off too, which you can just do with your fingers or something. Next, clean the tracks of the slider. Wipe the outside of it and try to get into these little corners here too. If anything but the track part of the slider is very dirty, you might want to consider a deep clean instead. For a soft clean, focus on these tracks. Also, make sure to brush out the bottom of the slider so that any dust, dirt or rust on the spring stem is taken care of. Finally, brush off the tactile leaf, the teeth, the back and between the fold so that there's no dirt on it anymore. So now you've cleaned the plate and case, housings, slider, leaf and actuator, so all the parts thoroughly. Now you just need to reassemble the switch. To do this, first stick the slider in the top housing. Most housings have two pips on one side, which is the side that the tactile leaf goes into, and a flatter side, which is where the switch plate goes. The slider usually has a notch on one side. This side always faces the switch plate, so in this case it would go in like this. Very old models such as SKCL Green have a smaller notch on both sides, and others like SKCM Brown have reversible top housings. In case of a reversible slider, I'd face the side of the slider that has scrapes on the surface towards the switch plate, and in case of a reversible top housing, I'd face it the same way as the other switches on the board. So what you do is first insert the slider, then insert the tactile leaf, like so, and then you push out the slider with your finger as much as possible while still keeping it in place with the leaf spring. This will make reassembling it easier. Next, stick the spring in the little pip in the middle of the bottom housing. If you're having difficulties with this, use a cocktail stick or a toothpick or something, like so. Make sure the spring is standing upright. Tilt the board if necessary so it won't fall over. Next, grabbing the assembled switch top, slide it over the spring using the notch on the slider to see where you're going. Just look over the top of it. I rotated the board so you can see what I'm doing. Here, I'll show you. There you go. Then, when you're over, push down the top housing and if necessary, recenter the slider so that it pops back into place. If you can't push it down all the way, either one of the parts is misaligned or you've stuck the top housing the wrong way around. Another way to do it, which is the preferred way for doing linear switches as they don't have a tactile or click leaf to keep the slider in place in the top housing, is to put the spring in and then the slider on top and then simply slide the other way around, slide the top housing over it, like so. Now test the switch by pushing it carefully. If you can feel a weird resistance right at the top, the spring isn't properly seated, so don't push it any further or you may damage it. If this happens, simply take the top off and try to reassemble it again. If you're having difficulty with this step, you can also pre-assemble the top with a spring in, like this, and push it in with a board placed upside down. Some people have found this method easier. Personally, I prefer doing it from the top. So now, after this, the switch is assembled and should feel better again. Do this with the entire board and you're all set. If the feel's still not great, you'll likely need to do a deep clean and or full restoration instead, which I'll be presenting in the next video, which is part 3. That's it for this tutorial, guys. Hope you found it useful, and see you next time.